Greetings. When thinking about futurism, one of the things that people will find surprising about our time is why the people of our time were surprised that a two-party system would fail, and why is it that the two-party system took this long to fail in a country like the United States? So fundamentally, what is wrong with a two-party system in this day and age versus in the past? In the age of social media, there is 24/7 saturation of news, and a large number of people spend hours per day on politics. That was not the case in the 1980s or even the 90s. The problem with this is that the psychological orientation of rooting for your sports team then gets translated to politics. And then what happens with that is that people think in terms of, I support my side independent of whether they have good ideas or not, much like you might support your sports team even if it happens to be one of the weaker teams in the sport. Good or bad, they're your team, so you support them anyway. This is a very, very counterproductive mentality in relation to politics, because politics should be dry and boring and about policy ideas and efficient allocation of resources in relation to mitigating the most extreme examples of good luck and bad luck, as well as distributing the costs of certain infrastructure that only the government can build correctly. Now that sounds dry and boring, but to understand this as the true function of political science and the government, you should see this video up here where I describe in just 15 minutes what the true function of government should be in a healthy society in its entirety. I mean, a lot of everyday people who vote Democrat do not condone the most extreme far-left woke politics, but since it's on their side and they're focused on fighting the other side, their tolerance for the extreme becomes much higher than it otherwise should be. Similarly, on the Republican Party, it's hard to categorize what the extreme really is. Some may say that white nationalism, etc., is the extreme, but that's not even really part of the Republican Party because their economic views are left-wing in many cases. The problem becomes that a different type of dysfunction is excused in the Republican Party, which is the dysfunction of surrendering, not fighting back, being convinced that retreat is not retreat, and the entire business model of the Republican Party is to persuade voters that losing is not really losing and therefore donate more money to us. And that's why we have a uniparty now among elected officials, because average people have been persuaded into rooting for one side versus the other when they are in far more alignment against the people than the average person realizes. I will say this, if you're someone who watched professional wrestling when you were young, as I did, then you'll become much more astute about discerning what is actually pretend fighting designed to make a big show while the two participants in the fight are actually working together. And it's the audience that is being led on. And in fact, politics is worse than that, because politics is really trying to deceive the audience, whereas professional wrestling is not actually claiming to pass itself off as real fighting. It did that through a lot of the 1980s, but by the 1990s, that premise was up, and they came clean by saying this is a form of theater that exists for entertainment and recognize it as such. If you're an American in 2024 and you're still particularly emotional about one party in relation to another, whichever of the two parties you're in favor of, you are many, many, many years behind the times. This whole notion of a uniparty and deep state is very real. And the reason this became inevitable is because in a two-party system, there's no incentive to strive for any absolute standard of quality. People would easily understand how any industry in the private sector, if it had only two market participants, the quality of product produced by each participant could just keep going down, because each participant only has to be slightly better than the other one in the short term, even though both are declining. And in the United States, we can clearly see that both the Democrat and the Republican Party have declined in quality very, very substantially relative to even the 1980s. Both parties were much better then than they are now. Both actually stood for something sane rather than seemingly trying to destroy the very society that they have been elected to preside over, to the extent that you believe even elections are valid and fair. Now, why did it take this long for a two-party system to fail? This is something that a relatively new country like the United States is unable to admit to itself. But for the first 200 years of our republic, and remember, the Democrat and Republican parties were not the first two parties. There used to be one party that split into two. And you had other parties like the Federalists and the Whigs and so forth that went away. But in a two-party system, as long as the society has a certain overarching morality, in this case Christianity, Protestant Christianity, then the parameters of the contest are still bound within a certain religious morality. It's not that religion itself is necessarily good, but there's a certain unspoken agreement of what the boundaries of acceptable conduct are. And I'm obviously not a Christian, yet even I recognize that this is true. Because once you have eradicated this religious underpinning, then the two-party system can veer into the strangest possible directions. And that's why the primary ideology of the United States and other English-speaking Western countries that orbit the United States has become one of fighting against nature, as I discuss in detail in this video up here. Fighting against nature has become prestigious when in fact it is the stupidest possible thing that a society can devote all of its resources towards, because it is the most unwinnable battle by definition. But that is why a two-party system fails when the unspoken assumption of a religious core is eliminated. And yes, it's important to separate church and state, and the same goes for every other country. At the same time, you shouldn't separate culture from state to such an extent that the parameters of a sane and decent society become forgotten and the strangest things get normalized. So while in the 20th century, plenty of Americans had a very well-rehearsed explanation about why the two-party system is better than, say, a parliamentary system that exists in some place like the United Kingdom, etc., that is not necessarily true today, because the two-party system is more vulnerable to corruption by new high-tech types of media, such as social media. A two-party system creates a level of acrimony that is not possible in a multi-party system, because enough people can be brainwashed into simply hating the other side, even without trying to understand the other side. If you pick about 20 randomly selected Americans, and putting aside the fact that certain racial demographics are heavily tilted towards voting for one party, but let's say 20 random Americans. For 16 of those 20, if you just observe their day-to-day activities in terms of they wake up, get ready, go to work, they make some food, etc., it will not be obvious who is a Democrat and who is a Republican just from that alone. Sure, the woman with the green hair and a lot of tattoos is probably on the far left, and the man with a red MAGA hat and a pickup truck is probably a Republican, but that does not mean that they are extreme in terms of treating members of the other side poorly automatically. And even then, those are just 4 out of the 20. The other 16 out of the 20 will generally function as normal people, and it will not necessarily be obvious that they vote for a certain party. And their views on any particular issue will not necessarily be predictable, aside from being aligned with one party and therefore watching the news associated with that party. One thing to keep in mind is that it's not that people have wildly different value systems, is that nobody knows what the facts are. If you watch news sources oriented towards one party, you will be told that the facts are a certain thing, and therefore your conclusion is based on an assumption that these are the correct facts. If you watch the news sources of another party entirely, the facts you will be told are true are themselves different, and therefore what you believe to be moral and just will be based on a different set of facts. So it's not that the value systems are as divergent as they appear to be. It is rather that people have been told different sets of facts. If all people could be told what the facts truly are, indisputably so, and without being tainted by either agenda, then people would have a lot more consensus about what should be done. The middle 80% of the country, let's say. The reason I say that the United States, being a new country, is particularly vulnerable is because despite a system existing for 240 plus years, and this being the most successful society ever created for a good amount of time, there is not an assumption about correcting things that are very obsolete. For example, Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, and that has been true since a time when the United States was just the first 13 states, and Washington, D.C. was in the geographical middle of the country, as well as close to the population center of the country. Now, because the United States has spanned all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and even has 2 states further to the west than that, the population-weighted center of the United States is actually in southern Missouri, not Washington, D.C., and therefore Washington, D.C. bureaucrats are not necessarily capable of judging what would be right for California, let alone for Alaska and Hawaii. And then when you add a modern media layer on top of that, you have situations like in San Francisco, they want to redistribute money in the name of reparations for slavery, even though San Francisco does not have a history of slavery. California only became part of the United States 10 years before slavery ended and was not a slave state itself. Other states only became part of the United States even after that. Arizona did not become a state until 1912. But when left-wing politicians in California talk about reparations based on slavery that occurred in the southeastern part of the United States, it is due to this need to comply with this broader left-wing narrative that still had no applicability to California there. It's even worse when you consider countries that orbit the United States. Australians pay more attention to U.S. politics than to their local politics, simply because the U.S. political industry produces enough content for it to be its own genre of reality TV, and since it's on television and attracts a larger production budget, it becomes the default viewership for Australians who think they're too smart to watch professional sports, but they're not. I mean, as I've mentioned elsewhere, my sister is a regular contributor on Australian political TV and is recognized by hundreds of thousands of people in doing so. And her gig over here, which is not even her full-time day job, her gig over here is to package up U.S. political opinion in a manner that is easily digestible for the Australian audience that is more concerned about politics in a country 10,000 miles away versus who their local mayor and city council members are, because that's not what's on television. If you take an older country, many of them have terrible systems and have had a lot of churn in their history. But one thing that's interesting is in France, where they have a system of recognizing, to some extent, that a certain constitution and set of assumptions has a life cycle that then reverts into a state of reset, which is often disruptive. But France has moved towards and away from democracy a few times. After the French Revolution, you had a dictatorship with Napoleon, and then from there you have a second, third, fourth, and now fifth republic. France is on a fifth republic, and the average republic has lasted 50 or 60 years. And when a republic ends, there is often a dictatorship as well. You have non-democratic regimes between different republics. That system has a lot of flaws too, but at least it recognizes that a certain set of assumptions around which a constitution is based may not last much longer than 60 or 70 years. So at least their framework is one that accounts for the cyclicality of politics. And the United States does not have that, because a lot of assumptions that were set 240 years ago are really, really revealing how outdated they are and how they're not serving the U.S. political needs of the 2020s and beyond properly at all. This is a complicated subject and a very underserved area of futurism, because most futurism does not talk about things like this. But if you like this type of content, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.